Okay, awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining today's Lunch and Learn about sediment dynamics and stream stabilization. We are the Idaho chapter of the American Water Resources Association, and I am this year's president. My name is Kendra Kaiser, and we've got a board of folks that help organize these seminars, and we're always interested in hearing people's interests for future seminars. And just a reminder that American Water Resources Association is dedicated to the advancement of water resources management, research, and education, and our members represent a community of water professionals with diverse backgrounds, but share engagement in solving some of the toughest water resources challenges. All of our past seminars that we've had this past year are linked on the AWRA webpage, which the link there is shown below. And you can check out those ones as well as upcoming events on the Idaho Water Resources events calendar. And we pull together events from different organizations across the state, and it's really convenient. You can link to your own calendar, whichever kind you have, which is handy. We are hoping to have a social sometime this summer. We're going to start planning that in the next month or so. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And we have a couple of more exciting lunch and learns in May. And today we are excited to have Andy Tranmer from the University of Idaho and Aaron Golart from the Idaho Water Resources.
Right? Yep.
And so Andy's going to present first today. He is a research professor at the University of Idaho in the Center for Ecohydraulics Research, located here in Boise. His research addresses the physical processes of complex aquatic systems and their respective influence on ecological resilience, responsible alluvial design, and river restoration. A greater understanding of the physical mechanisms occurring in the riparian corridor allow for prediction of geomorphic evolution, habitat suitability, and ecosystem performance to guide sustainable resource management and public policy. A complementary suite of field numerical and laboratory studies are employed further the current state of knowledge in these dynamic environments. And recent work in Idaho has assessed reservoir operations to guide floodplain sustainability, vegetation dynamics, and endangered species recovery. And he's also worked on international projects examining fluvial networks in Chile and Patagonia and large-scale flume experiments in Korea to quantify transport mechanics during alluvial channel evolution. And so after Andy's presentation, I'll introduce Aaron. And so I can go ahead and hand it over to you all.
Thanks, Kendra.
Yeah.
Let's see here, trying to get the right screen. All right, do you guys see the screen that says, if you can see this, I'm sharing the wrong screen?
Nope.
Perfect. I love it when that happens. All right. So this is some work that was related to some things I was helping the flood control district with a few years ago, looking at stream bank erosion and how riparian vegetation may impact that. And let's see here. So in 2017, as you guys probably know, the Boise River experienced high flows for 100 days straight. And this extended duration flood caused substantial bank erosion occurring along the length of the entire river. And so you can see here is an example of 220 feet of outer bank erosion since 2006 that occurred, with more than half of it occurring during the 2017 event alone. And so the 2017 event was really successful at revealing all of these hidden areas of bank erosion. And in response, the flood control district tried to improve their physical understanding of these bank erosion processes that are occurring. And bank erosion is problematic because the Boise River went from this in 1939 to this today, where there's a lot of investment in less than ideal locations. And so while it is important to protect local infrastructure and property, nobody wants to see this going on, right? So therefore, I think it's important to understand the processes and balance how much hardscaping we are really willing to invest in. And bank erosion is particularly tricky because even though we tend to focus on the negative aspects of it, there's some real benefits that should be acknowledged. And from a negative consequences side, bank erosion tends to damage property and infrastructure, and is all around expensive to avert and or slow down. However, from the benefit side, bank erosion creates these physical disturbances that support both riparian and aquatic habitats. You know, everything from vegetation succession to morphologic change in the channel by creating pools and riffles. So really creating the physical habitat in the channel. And this is particularly important in managed rivers below dams like the Boise that have limited flood disturbances and limited upstream sediment supply from the basin. And a perfect example of this is managing the appropriate sediment size for spawning fish habitat. And in the Boise River, since there's no upstream sediment supply from the basin because of Lucky Peak, this leads to extremely coarse sediment through the Boise and Garden City area. However, as we go downstream, sediment size tends to decrease owing to sediment input from bank erosion. And for example, we can see here whereby the gravels in Garden City are 350 millimeters and the gravel size in Star are 30 times smaller, on the order of 12 millimeters. And if we acknowledge that the range of salmon spawning gravels between 8 and 128 millimeters, that poses real ecological consequences for fish habitat if the river cobbles are simply too large to spawn in. So why does bank erosion occur? You know, we tend to see channel irregularities and bends that preferentially push flow to one side of the channel, and that tends to locally increase sediment transport capacity at that particular localized location. And you can see in the schematic, it illustrates how the high velocity core shifts toward the outer bank through the bend. And we tend to see erosion along the outer bank and deposition here along the point bar. And this hydraulic instability really creates the dynamics that we see in the channel. And this tends to result in an iterative process seen here during each high water event. And, you know, we start with an original bank profile here, and we get toe slope erosion and an undercutting that results in eventual bank collapse. And then during the next high water event, you get hydraulic removal of those sediments by sediment transport, which exposes the face again, and you see this process occur once again. And in the Boise River, the primary erosion mechanism is bank slump. And this is because the stream banks are made primarily of unconsolidated glacial outwash sediments. You can see here it's mixed sand and cobbles. There's localized cohesive clays, but they're pretty spatially limited. And so what we tend to see is these mixed sediment stream banks tend to just slump as the toe is eroded. And as a consequence, you get coarse cobbles that lag behind on the bed, and the sand and fine gravels are moved downstream. And so to combat this process, there are many engineering choices available that have definitely evolved over time, beginning from this less traditional approach here, seen in many places that was definitely existing in the Boise River in the 50s and 60s, and then it's moved towards more focus of just straight rock. And now the latest and greatest is this bioengineered approach, where we use all of these brush mattresses and cuttings, soil lifts, what have it. You guys are probably more familiar with this than I am. But really the goal is to stabilize the bank in the short term until vegetation can establish. But what we're really lacking is an understanding of how mature vegetated stream banks respond to floods to advise long-term management decisions. And in other words, what type of riparian environment do we want to target that effectively achieves our goals? Do we want forests? Do we want grasslands? Do we want to encourage erosion in some places and reduce it in others? And so vegetation has many ways it impacts stream bank erosion and those processes. Let's see, from a mechanics standpoint, riparian vegetation tends to interact with flow both above and below ground. And so during a flood, when the water goes over bank, vegetation tends to slow velocity in the floodplain and promote sediment deposition. And you can see the resultant deposition here in the floodplain in Garden City, where in and around these vegetation components, you get about a foot of sand that covers these former very coarse cobble bars. Additionally, below ground, roots can increase bank structure by providing tensile strength to the soil matrix, as seen here. Roots can form dense mats that overhang and protect the soil from hydraulic forces, as you can see here. And roots have the additional benefit of wedging in these unconsolidated coarse particles that are tucked up and around here, and it effectively increases the soil cohesion. So all of these act in concert together to reduce bank erosion. And to understand how these different vegetation types impact bank erosion and channel morphology in the Boise, I took a look at this river segment here outlined in this box that has a general gradient of vegetation with cottonwoods and silver maples primarily here up here through Boise and Garden City, and those transition into sort of sparse grassland and mixed isolated tree species through the middle of this, and then down by Caldwell, there's a greater emphasis of having false indigo shrubs along the stream bank. And so I used a clustered survey approach here, whereby I surveyed 48 cross sections in 2017 and 2018 that were previously surveyed in 1998 and 2002, and then were again captured with the green LiDAR survey in 2007. And so here you can see an example of outer bank erosion occurring over time. The white mark here is the cross section, and this red line here indicates the old left outer bank in 2002. And over here on the right, we have a time series of those survey dates, whereby the gray line here is the survey channel in 2002, and then the orange is 2007, the blue is 2017, and the yellow is 2018. And so over the 20 years, we can see that there is about 160 feet of bank erosion that has occurred, and that was principally driven in high flows during 2012 and 2017. And so you can see that the channel tended to migrate to the left bank and the outer bank, and it widened. And an interesting note is that the width, it's very similar to the width of the channel in 1939, which was very much a disturbance-oriented channel. And so in each of those cross sections, the riparian vegetation was categorized, and I chose 4 categories: riparian trees, principally made up of silver maple and black cottonwood, and false indigo shrubs, grasses, and individual sparse trees. And then I compared that with riprap. And so from a purely observational standpoint, we're looking at median percent change in channel width over 20 years. And you can see that riprap had a pretty low percentage, about 1% change in its channel width. The mixed riparian forest was about 5% change, and grasses and false indigo were between 11 and 16%. However, these empirical results really don't capture the erosional forces in the channel during a flood that may vary by location, right? So I normalized the results by the simulated bankful velocity from a 1D Heckgrass model. And while one-dimensional models don't capture the variability in flow at a cross-section, they do provide a first-order estimate of the hydraulic forces in the channel during a bankful event. And so I modeled it at 8,000 CFS. And unsurprisingly, riprap was still the lowest amount of width change that we saw, but the cottonwood and maple were only about 1.5% width change in width, whereby the grass and the false indigo were much higher, about 10 times higher than the riprap. More surprisingly, I would say that I found that the grasses and the sparse tree cover were similar to the false indigo here, which can grow in very dense patches. And that was pretty surprising to me. The other surprising finding was that the bank erosion with forest cover was really not that much different from riprap after I normalized it by the bankful velocity. And so I would say visually, it's pretty surprising how these two could possibly have similar erosion rates. However, I think it makes a little more sense if we consider the species' rooting depths. And grasses have a rooting depth of about 0.5 to 1.5 feet, whereby false indigo has a rooting depth of 2 to 3 feet. And if we consider the average bank height in the Boise River is about 6 feet, we can see that these shallow rooted species simply don't go to the bottom of the stream bank. And so that toe slope erosion that we were looking at in the schematic earlier occurs effectively below the rooting depth of these and undercuts these vegetation and still allows bank collapse to occur. In contrast, I would say that riparian forest species have a much greater rooting depth of about 10 to 16 feet. And so those roots have the ability to anchor the plant below the scour depth that occurs within the channel. And they have a high inundation tolerance, so those roots don't drown. And that creates this buttressing root system seen in this upper photo that provides that hydraulic sheltering effect to the soil matrix behind it. And it should be noted that willows were not included in this study simply because they don't have a big presence on the Boise. But from an engineering perspective, we know that willows are definitely the most common restoration plant. And they have a rooting depth of about 3 to 7 feet, dependent upon the species that are being used. And therefore, I have the expectation that they'd probably be less effective than tree species in terms of long-term bank erosion. However, I think the critical point to consider here is that we're really looking at the ratio of rooting depth to local bank height. And so the message to take home is that we really need to select the appropriate vegetation type to cover the toe of the bank. And so you really want to get this rooting depth over bank height ratio greater than 1. And so, for example, if you were to have a 3-foot bank, willows might be a perfect solution for that. But if you have a 10-foot bank that you're trying to deal with, you're going to have to get really creative with the strategy that you use. And so from sort of a more pragmatic standpoint, I'd also say that, you know, if you are doing a bank repair project and you're installing willow cuttings, it might be worth your time just to chuck in a couple of cottonwoods for some long-term protection. And finally, I would say at the larger watershed management scale, the question arises, what do we do with this information? And so I would say, given the efficacy and low cost of riparian trees in reducing bank erosion, the ultimate goal would simply be to protect native riparian forests whenever possible. And conceptually, that would be trying to create this defensible space for the community from the inevitable action of river migration. And so we can use this conceptual river corridor seen here to guide those, whereby you kind of provide enough buffer zone to let those migrating meanders work their magic in the downstream direction and not interfere with all the infrastructure and stuff that we love to put in the way. So that's pretty much all I got. Any questions, or you want to go to Aaron?
We can take some questions now. That'd be great. And folks can either unmute yourself to ask questions, or you can also ask questions in the chat. I have one question while we wait for folks to mull on questions. I guess what does the flood control district think about how your results might impact their choices, management choices?
That's an excellent question, Kendra. You know, they got a tough situation, and I think most of their projects occur on private land, and so, you know, they may not have the flexibility to always make the appropriate decision, just because, you know, they can't. There's not space to do it, right? There's infrastructure, power lines. Nobody wants to plant a cottonwood forest under a cotton line or power lines.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. The reality of managing a system that is so heavily urbanized is quite different than what might be the ideal options.
Sure. Yeah.
Indra, this is Zach with Ada County. I have a question.
Yeah.
And I guess it kind of ties into the flood 10 discussion. I think they've found what you discussed or shared with us regarding the root depth of willows. I think they've adjusted what they used to do with putting willows closer down, maybe mid-bank in their restoration so that they're in water and they have a better chance of growing there. And that leads to my question. The equation you have for the greater than 1 root depth equation, would that apply also mid-bank? Meaning if you did a row of vegetation mid-bank, you could make sure that those root depths get below the bottom of the channel and would still meet that requirement?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Zach, is that you got to think of this as a collective barrier in creating a vegetative protective boundary for the soil matrix. So as long as you can keep the willows at the top alive that might not be able to have access to the water, and you can plant them low enough down where they have some aeration of the roots, I think that's a very effective strategy.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Andy, this is Chase. I had a quick question. I'm wondering, are you aware of, or did you make any observations of downstream impacts to the banks and the channel, just based off of comparing these different restoration techniques? A lot of times riprap is great at reducing erosion and maintaining that channel width, but was there any observations made of how these types of techniques compare to immediately downstream and the impacts downstream?
Yeah, that's super important as well, Chase. I found that there were not severe to moderate bank erosion at the transition of all of these different environments. And so particularly, yeah, I guess I would say that contiguous vegetative cover and or riprap is beneficial to breaking it up, because certainly at the end of a immobile riprapped channel, you can really get a lot of sediment transport capacity, particularly upstream where there might not be sediment supply, where it might be sediment supply limited. And so things are quite erosive, and it just blasts whatever happens downstream. So the transition points are critical at protecting, I would say. And occurs regardless. It could happen between riprap and vegetation, or between different vegetation types. Yep.
Hi, my name is Mike. I've got a quick question for clarification on that equation right there, Andrew. You've got bank height. Did you say that bank height should include scour depth as well?
If possible, yeah, for sure. However, estimating scour depth is pretty challenging, given it's such a dynamic thing. But regardless, yeah, if you can get under the vegetative protection, negative results will, even if you put rock at the toe of that slope, if you create a scour hole below that rock is going to eventually fall in, right? So really estimating scour depth beforehand is critical for that.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for all those questions. And if any other questions come up, definitely put them in the chat room, or you can hold them to the end after Aaron's presentation. So Aaron, while I introduce you, you can get your slides up. And Aaron Golart works as the state coordinator for stream protection for the stream protection program administered by the Idaho Department of Water Resources. He works to develop program policies, meet legislative mandates, and provides technical analysis on statewide natural resources matters. Prior to his current position at IDWR, he worked as a water right agent for the Snake River Basin Adjudication and a fisheries technician with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game in the Eagle Health Fish Laboratory and the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station and the Henry's Fork Foundation. His educational background includes a Bachelor of Science in Ecology from Idaho State University, graduate coursework focused on hydrology and resource management at Boise State University, and an associate degree in biology from Columbus State Community College. It is great to have you here, Aaron, and I'm sure I always plug this for students, but all of the different places that you worked for is certainly a really interesting compilation. And I would encourage any students on the call to definitely ask questions about career paths and things like that as well. So I'll hand it off to you, Aaron.
Aaron, I think you're still muted.
Very good. How about now?
You're great.
All right. Thanks for having me today. Sorry. It's going to be some growing pains potentially. So I guess I'm going to touch on more or less some stream bank stabilization treatments, things that, I've seen in my tenure with the department. I'm going to focus on these projects, and I think all the examples I'm giving are good quality projects, well constructed. But, as I've learned through the years, there's always room for improvement. And a lot of it's observational, kind of tweaking things in the field, see what works, what doesn't. So in general, these examples that I'm going to give you are all pretty good projects, I think, but then I'll give you some examples of alternatives. So here you have, a pretty standard eroding stream bank, rural area. You have a pasture in the background. Common theme, I think Andy touched on. You're gonna have a point bar and outside bend, eroding stream bank, lack of riparian vegetation. And so folks, when they're dealing with production in ag fields and operations, whether it's urban or rural, there's obviously concerns with losing property or production ground. So this is a pretty common theme throughout the state of Idaho here. So what are the solutions? One being riprap. And I picked this example to be a little bit critical of. This is on the Big Lost. You can see I don't think there's any vegetation planted. The slope's fairly steep. The rock's not likely keyed in. And I question whether the rock's sizable enough for the velocities you'd see on a river like the Big Wood. Pardon me, this is the Big Lost. So there's some issues there. And when we're dealing with bank stabilization projects, oftentimes you can deal with habitat loss, and eroding stream banks, that's a natural process. Undercut stream banks provide valuable habitat for aquatic species. And so in these cases where we come in and potentially rock a stream bank that, yes, is eroding, you are seeing a loss of that valuable aquatic habitat. So numerous functions of a healthy riparian habitat, but I think in the case of the realm I work in, dealing with erosion and trying to halt it, yet improve habitat, some of the important functions of riparian habitat are diffusing stream energy, reducing flood damage and erosion, and providing fish and wildlife habitat. That's a really important component. So here's my first example. It's on the North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River. And Andy did touch on this. We have on the upstream end of this project and the downstream end, there is existing riprap. It looks to me like it's pretty much dumped rock riprap, lacks vegetation. So what occurs oftentimes on these outside bends where you have rich riprap on the upstream and downstream ends is severe erosion in between them. And that's what's occurring here. So here's this leaning tree again that I used for reference, and you can see that upstream riprap there. And this stream bank's pretty much failing into upland species, these conifers, and it's just scalloping inward. And so how do you deal with this situation? And again, it's a common situation where you deal with these. Oftentimes the start point and the end point of these riprap jobs or any bank stabilization project for that matter, would be property boundaries. And so they're pretty arbitrary. They're not necessarily the best starting or ending point for a bank treatment, but you have different philosophies. Some folks have the philosophy, I'm going to leave the stream alone, and other folks want to, hold that line. And so these starting and ending points can be pretty arbitrary, and you see the struggles with, a treatment ending abruptly, potentially not in the appropriate location, and then downstream or upstream erosion occurring. So this is the ground view of the same project. You can see that leaning tree again. Good view of the upstream riprap. And this is where the treatment, it's going to be a riprap treatment. And I put this line in here, the dotted dash line. This is pre-construction, obviously. Just give a rough idea where I would consider ordinary high water mark, or maybe where the elevation would fall for channel forming flows. Before placing that rock and doing your bank treatment, it's important to slope the bank back, get your willow bundles in, or any other native. Generally it's shrubs, but I think obviously overstory is important, cottonwoods and other species, and then trenching them in vertically as well. So important component. Oftentimes folks will put in the rock and say, I'm going to plant it later. And I strongly discourage that. It's unsuccessful. And it's pretty costly and labor intensive to try and do it afterwards. So here we have the finished product. And I think overall they did a pretty good job. The rock looks graded appropriately. It's revegetated. This is 2 years after construction. And the rock goes from toe slope all the way up to the top of bank. And again, the dotted dashed line, I think, will make a little bit more sense here with the next slide, which my thought would be, well, what are the alternatives here? One I would recommend is a very similar treatment, but where the toe rock comes up slope and ends in and around where that ordinary high water would be, or channel forming flow, and then a more gradual slope breaking down that bank in an aggressive planting effort to reestablish that vegetation and again provide as much habitat as you possibly can when dealing with these stream restoration projects. So again, not to be critical of the original design, but I guess I'm always trying to brainstorm about how we can improve upon projects. And so I see benefit here where during a flood event, you could have flows coming through this vegetated area, slowing velocities, dropping out sediment, and then potentially reducing any adverse downstream impacts compared to just a hardened structure abruptly ending. So my next example would be the St. Joe River up north. There's a pre-construction photo and post-construction. The erosion effects here are a little bit unusual for a river in the sense that the primary impact is due to boat wakes. And so this erosion is occurring from recreational boating up and down the river. And so I think that this lower photo shows that, you know, it's a unique riprap job in the sense that the substrate size on that rock riprap isn't large at all. It's sized according to the velocities that you'd expect to encounter on that reach of river. And it's about cobble sized and graded with some gravels. The treatment was sloped and planted with native woody vegetation. So 2 years later, on the upper photo, you see the woody vegetation coming in, some wood racking in that woody vegetation. I don't think that was added as part of the project. There's some racking even on the floodplain there that you see. And then the lower photo is 4 years after construction. So we have good woody species recruitment and sediment falling out. And so overall, I think this looks like a pretty successful project. Just from my perspective, what would I do to potentially improve upon this is, I think there was potential to add some large woody material in the active channel below the high water mark. But maybe that wasn't practical considering the level of recreational use this river corridor sees. So there's always that perspective that you need to have when considering treatments, that, you know, there could be uses that would conflict with that type of treatment. So this is onto the Big Wood River. Again, outside Meander, eroding pretty badly. A lot of times you need to kind of look at the land management that's occurring adjacent to the river. And in this case, you have irrigated landscape with no riparian vegetation immediately adjacent to the stream channel. And so I often see this, whether it's in agricultural operations or urban. This similar example where folks are just watering their lawn. We see it all up and down the Boise, where you'll have active erosion from the river itself during high flows, but actually also erosion occurring from backslope resulting from over irrigation and saturated soils. So in this case, the treatment that was proposed is a little bit more progressive and a bioengineering type treatment where they're going to incorporate large woody material with the root wads intact, placed out into the IDAWRA, and build back that bank, but at a very gradual slope in the effort to establish what's called a floodplain bench. So you'd have a small floodplain bench at about ordinary high water, and then working its way up to that landscape. And then obviously they're going to plant some riparian vegetation on the upslope. This is a similar example, larger in scale, on the Yankee fork of the Salmon River. Again, outside bend, point bar, pressing on this. This is addressing some bank erosion, but there are other historical issues up on the Yankee fork. If you're familiar with it, it was historically dredged, and so this is a large-scale restoration effort. But I thought this was a interesting similar treatment, just larger in scale. This is the plan view of that. Excuse me. Of that treatment. You can see how they rack the wood in there, they lattice it or stack it in all directions, some parallel to flow, some perpendicular, some pointed at a 45-degree angle. I always chuckle a little bit when you look at these great diagrams and then out on the you might think it looks sloppy. It looks natural, obviously, but it's interesting to see that perspective in the before and after, at least relating to the diagrams. This is a cross-section diagram, pretty straightforward. Did want to make note that it's hard to see on the plan view diagram is important component would be getting your footer logs or even rock keyed in below the initial wood placement, and ultimately that should be below scour depth so that you can secure your structure and help prevent it from undermining. Some undermining is obviously good for fish, but you don't want to undermine your whole structure to potentially cause it to fail. And then you can see that the floodplain bench, so to speak, is revegetated with your native riparian species. Another very similar circumstance on Wolf Lodge Creek. You have a grazed pasture, point bar, vertical eroding stream bank. Part of the problem potentially here is, well, obviously the creek's down cutting, but the lack of riparian species that have been, I guess, eradicated from this pasture. You can see a pretty good stand in the background there. So this is afterwards. The first photo was zoomed in. You can see that post fence there. But what they did here was they sloped the stream banks, revegetated with native species, and also really did a good job about incorporating large woody material and embedding it in the stream banks, but also within the floodplain to add, floodplain or channel roughness, so that when things do come over bank, you slow velocities and hopefully prevent something catastrophic from occurring. Now, I think some people might ask, well, why would someone want to lower their stream banks and put this risk at potentially greater structure? My typical response to that would be, yeah, I think I would tend to agree that, you could have some foundational damage or annual flooding that may occur close to that structure, but this type of treatment would reduce the potential for, in my opinion, for a catastrophic event, channel avulsion, something, the channel continuing to downcut and potentially getting underneath that structure and completely washing it away. So it's a balancing act. Are you willing to get your feet wet periodically, or risk a potential for a catastrophic type event? Back to the St. Joe. This is an interesting one. In a lot of aspects, maybe similar to the lower Boise, where you have such a tall, eroding, vertical stream bank. That looks like 8-10 feet to me. Now, at a glance, when I first see projects like this, I'm like, oh my goodness, like, look at those barbs. Those are really big, and that's a lot of rock. And I always tend to try and encourage folks to limit the use of rock when it's practical, for a variety of reasons. Rock's very expensive, and then more natural products could be available there locally, and so there could be a cost savings there. But in this case, I generally recommend that people construct barbs so that they are overtopping during low flow, just a little bit over the top. You don't see them exposed over, similar to this, but again, all these projects I think were well constructed. So briefly, barbs are designed to have flow come over the top and deflect about a 45-degree angle away from the bank you're trying to protect, and then create an area where sediment can deposit and then in theory revegetate. And so that's the objective here, to allow this area to kind of reheal itself. So after some regrading and seeding, the rock that's up on that bank isn't as obvious. So right here, this is immediately after construction. things are looking a little bit better after some reseeding and grading. This photo is 8 years later, and you can see just the very tip, the end of that bank barb, might even be 3 or 4 feet. So what has occurred through the years here is sediment has fallen out and recruitment of the vegetation has occurred. And so they built back 25 plus feet of stream bank. And you can't really even tell that there's bank barbs there. So overall, I think it was a pretty successful project. What could be improved upon potentially? You know, I had my bias and, you know, my background's in fish and stream ecology, so I like wood and potentially woody log jam deflectors used with or instead of the large bank barbs or groins. They certainly are going to provide good quality aquatic habitat, and I think if constructed properly, you can accomplish the same purpose or the same result as using the rock bank barbs. I think in these cases, you need to make sure that obviously the wood is secured correctly and keyed into the bank. The top example is even, you know, a project likely over in Oregon or Washington where they even have some critical infrastructure there that they're trying to protect. I don't know that I've seen something quite that progressive here in Idaho yet. So this is my last slide. These are what's called soil lifts. It's a much softer approach than just about anything else. I think the message I wanted to make or convey here is that a treatment needs to be picked that's acceptable for the area. Obviously, you want to find a good local reference reach and build your treatment so that it's not foreign to the area. Certainly, you know, a landowner could decide that they want to place rock in this area. This is a spring creek in the Teton Basin, but then you would just have, you know, foreign material in an area that would have been overkill, so to speak, where these softer treatments, which can be much cheaper, they're a little bit more labor intensive potentially because they're a lot of handwork, but you'll find a lot of success, and then you don't have a bank treatment that's just kind of a foreign treatment in a certain watershed or drink. That's all I got.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Those were some really interesting examples. It was really cool to see the variety of approaches, and particularly that last one in the St. Joe, seeing 8 years later, and also thinking about, you know, what alternative mechanisms are to get similar results. So we'll open up for any questions for Aaron, or if any other ones have cropped up for Andy. And again, you can either unmute and ask or put one in the chat. And also while we're waiting for questions to come in, it'd be great to hear from everybody where you're coming from. So you can write in the chat who you work for, what part of the state you're in. It'd be great to just see where folks are joining from. And with that, I'll just open it up for folks for questions.
I had one for you, Aaron. You mentioned, I guess in that last example with the barbs, you know, bringing in rock, obviously it's going to be foreign to that, at least the stream, even if it is sourced fairly locally, and how that cost can go up. But it is, you know, maybe the logistics and the construction cost of dumping that rock is lower versus getting, you know, getting the large woody debris in and getting that keyed in and placed and everything. But how does that balance out cost-wise and project-wise?
Comparing the softer approach with rock?
Yeah, or like the example you had from Oregon or Washington with, you creating those barbs with the?
I think it really depends on where your where your project's located. So
Okay.
rock sources are pretty prevalent in some areas in the state, and elsewhere, depending on the geology, you have to truck it in miles and miles. So so the East Fork of the Salmon comes to mind. There's not a lot of good localized source rock there, but most of these folks who are ranchers, farmers, they have willow stock and cottonwood and down trees and trees maybe they wanted live trees and they've been thinking about knocking over, and so all of those are sources for material. So when you're out there, you can discuss those options with them because they have what they see as a problem, an eroding stream bank. They want to figure out a solution, and some of them may not have the means to truck in rock 50, 80, 100 miles. So I'm not sure I'm completely answering your question, but it really is case by case. I mean,
so maybe more leaning the material cost to get that material into the stream is heavier than the implementation cost, I guess.
Correct. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So on the ground construction, correct. So the logistics of trucking the rock in, paying someone to truck it in, you have to pay your source. And so if you can reduce your volume of rock from, let's just say 10 trucks to 1 truck because you're using some localized material, that's a savings.
Awesome, thanks.
Hey, Aaron, is there ever an example that you have found whereby the bank treatment actually improves habitat locally?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of these kind of the tree revetment treatments, the one on the big wood that I gave an example for. I mean, I wouldn't say there's a lot of habitat value with that scoured out hole leading into the lawn. So by placing large wood and creating a floodplain bench. So one, the wood would provide habitat during, let's say, base flow, but then that roughened floodplain bench that's going to have large woody material embedded on top, including vegetation. So during a moderate flood event, that's going to provide refuge as well.
Kind of as a follow-up to that, Aaron, given that you have seen probably the worst of the worst and the best of the worst, do you guys have an example of best practices or some kind of information that either on your website or something that you guys can provide to folks to see what, maybe just to make your job easier so you don't have to tell them no all the time, but saying like, this is good, this is better, and this is best? Sure.
We rely pretty heavily in this region on the NRCS Aberdeen Springfield Research Center documents. And so there's a wide variety of those that are readily available. You know, that's a good idea. Should probably put some links on our website. We haven't done that, but those documents, and then you know, through the years I've acquired others, but I think that's a good point you make, that we should probably have some of those resources available on our website.
Yeah, and Aaron, if you have any that you think of after the meeting, you can email them to us and we can put them up with the recording on the AWRA website as well.
Okay. Yeah.
I guess I have a question that's kind of, oh, actually, here's one from Jeff Connor. I'll ask his first and then I can follow up with mine. His question is, do you have any suggestions on how to improve willow and cottonwood survival after planting? For example, planting depth, irrigation, animal protection.
Okay. So ultimately, like to get it, get the willow cuttings down into the wetted depth of the soil profile. So taking your cuttings when they're dormant, that's an important component, or clumps when they're dormant. So late fall through early spring, planting them. If you're doing cuttings, using sharp, clean shears to shear off that end, soaking them for 3 to 5 days, and then planting those cuttings or bundles, making sure you get the cut end down into the wetted soil profile. And then afterwards, after you've backfilled your treatment, you want to trim those willows to about 3-4 inches. You don't want to have 3 or 4 feet of stem coming out of the ground. The reason being is once you trim that top, the next growing season, few growing seasons, they put most of the energy, the cuttings put most of their energy into producing roots. And so there's not a lot of vegetative growth at the top. It's mostly going into root production. And I think that, it would be a concern as far as grazing on them, but if you do that correctly, I think you'll see more success than if you do have 3 or 4 feet coming out of the ground. One, the plant will just start sprouting leaves, growing leaves, and so that energy is transferred into leaf production, not root production. And then if an animal comes along and eats it, then you could see some mortality. So really, your bottom line is you're trimming it back so that you're not seeing there's nothing there for them to eat. I think there was a third question there, but
I think you covered most of it, survival afterwards, which is great. My question was kind of a follow-on to Andy's in some ways. I wonder, given your experience in this state, is there a reason why people are more likely to start with rock versus going with large woody debris? Is it just because the research on it is newer, or it was just historically a standard practice when rock is available, or like what is that challenge there?
I think it's a historic practice. I mean, that's the way things had been done for years. Change is difficult. And I think, let's face it, if riprap's constructed correctly, well-graded rock, sloped appropriately, keyed into the bed of the river, you have appropriate transitions on the upstream and downstream ends. There's some other factors. It works well. It will lock the channel in place and you'll see a long-term stable confined channel. I mean, it works. But there are other methods that can work as well and will help offset some of that habitat loss, so to speak.
Yep. Aaron and Andy, this is Mike Schubert. I had a quick question for you. One thing that is kind of a recurring theme in both talks was land use in the riparian area. Whether that's the vegetative practices or the development practices, either putting infrastructure and high value land at risk, or leading to a vegetative condition that doesn't encourage a stable bank. When a decision like that, when a decision on land use is made, it seems like it's hard to go back, right? Once someone decides they're going to develop an area, or they're going to plant up to the river's edge, it's hard to go back, and it seems like it's hard to go back and establish a riparian area. I was wondering if you had examples of kind of proactive land use changes in the state where either we've started establishing a riparian corridor with, Andy, like you were saying, with a stand of riparian trees or something like that, that kind of gets out in front of the impending bank failure. Aaron, Andy, do either of you have examples of that in the state?
Aaron, I got nothing, man. So
Okay.
it's on you.
All right. So Mike, make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. Are you talking about preventative land management prior to the disturbances, the loss of riparian, or
either that, either preventative land management or kind of, I would say, almost proactive land management, where you've had success in an area that was row cropped up to the river's edge, where a producer or farmer has gone in and reestablished a riparian buffer.
Sure. Yeah, the upper Lemhi is a prime example. The upper salmon. There's a lot of federal money going in up there to help restore salmon and steelhead habitat, mostly bull trout. So the land use in the past obviously was farming and ranching. A lot of putting streams where they want them to be, spring sources where they want them to be, channelizing them so you can maximize production. And now there's a very strong effort. Fish and Game is partnered with a lot of the landowners to help restore those areas and more or less put it back to habitat that's been lost for 50, 80 years. Yeah, there's a number of projects up there. As far as kind of preventative, I think you're seeing communities become more aware that the value of having a riparian corridor and limiting or regulating development to preserve that. Blaine County is probably a pretty good example. They have a robust stream channel and floodplain program. I think the challenges there are the resources that folks have that want to develop certain areas of the riparian corridor. But I'm optimistic. I think you're going to see a shift in these areas like the Lemhi, where folks are going to start utilizing the funding to help restore the habitat that's been degraded from the land management or land use in those areas. And a significant driver of that is obviously ESA related species and funding associated with that.
This is Zach with Ada County. Just a quick add-on for that. I think what you're doing here is really important for education, because sometimes the people that write the code or try to enforce it don't have all the background or experience, and it's nobody's fault, but we don't know what we don't know. So let's say in a land use code, there's a riparian protection easement or overlay district. Sometimes defining what riparian is can cause a challenge. So it's kind of an ongoing education on what does that mean? Top of bank, is it based on vegetation? So this conversation's, I think, really fantastic to get out there and have good discussions with everybody writing the code and charged with enforcing the code too. So thanks.
Thanks, Zach. That's a really great point. And, like I said at the beginning of the meeting, all of the officers for AWRA are really excited to hear about any other things that are of interest to folks. If there's like specific conversations that would be helpful to bring folks together, definitely get in touch with us. And I'll just say thank you again to Aaron and Andy for presenting. It was really great hearing from you both, and really cool to think about all the different ways that we can move the state forward in how we work on these types of projects. So I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and thanks for joining.